Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Welcome to the City of London.
The City of London.
The next station is Bank. Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
The financial heart of the country.
The City.
The City.
Welcome to In the City.
Stand clear of the doors, please.
Today's the day. It's election day, a moment to really reminisce on the past 6 weeks. I like it that there's short cycles, election cycles in the UK. It feels like it's over and done with pretty quickly.
Yeah, I've just got back from the US where that is not the case. And they've just had the earliest ever presidential debate. I know everyone's seen it through clenched fists or fingers, whatever, because it was almost unwatchable. I did feel the contrast. Coming back to Britain this week, you see the choice that Britain has. And yes, you can like or loathe both Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. But when you saw the options on stage in America, you know, the convicted felon and the guy who couldn't string a sentence together, frankly, I mean, you know, it makes me feel a little bit better about the options that Britain faces.
And nobody says that our TV debates were quite good, but I thought they were quite good. I know I'm sad.
Well, there was
really
a bit
need
more
to get
substance
out more.
in that. I mean, what was the bid in the US one where they started slanging off about the golf thing?
Golf.
And then said, you're a child. I mean, it was just...
They couldn't remember their handicap. So I just got back from Sintra, and it was interesting. Everyone wanted to know about the French elections because there's so much drama there that it does make, you know, the UK safe and stable.
Isn't that a nice place to be? Safe and stable, find it, or a little bit boring?
A little bit boring, but we're still expected to find money to pay for some of the policies that Labour will have to put in place if they come to power.
Friday morning is going to be a big moment of change if the polls are correct for Britain, and a huge intro of problems to fix.
Yeah, people are fixated on the potential likely departure of the Conservative Party and their infighting. But I think that for all that there will be lots of excitement and sense of new brooms and all of that, I think you can already see, and we've already talked about them in this election campaign and before, you can already see the fault lines of proper division. And as you say, guys, there's been pieces on Bloomberg about the UK is becoming a safe haven. And that is surely welcome after lots of the events of the last, 7-8 years in the UK. But equally, it's not an easy wicket for Starmer and co.
Welcome to In the City, a podcast from Bloomberg about the stories important to the City of London. I'm Francine Lacqua.
I'm Lacqua Stratton.
And I'm David Merritt.
Phil Aldrich yesterday wrote a story saying that the Labour government, of course, is also facing the worst economic and fiscal inheritance for any government since the war. So we have to talk about where they'll find the money and how they spend it. But what's the strategy? Our next guest, Breakout Capital Chief Investment Officer and best-selling author Ruchir Sharma, thinks the government is just doing too much. He basically goes back and says, look, we think that government intervention has been shrinking. He says, not so. Ruchir, thank you so much for joining us here in the studio for the podcast.
Sure.
So this is a very interesting book. First of all, congratulations. What went wrong with capitalism? There's a belief, I guess, out there that the government has done less in previous years than they have in the past. And actually, we don't have that much government intervention. And you argue in 325 pages, you argue that that's not the case. And actually, the government is ever more present with regulation and also giving money.
Yes, as you know, that one of the most pejorative terms these days is neoliberal. Mm-hmm. That people speak about neoliberal to believe that these are people who have let market forces run amok, and that the role of the government has been downsized and the government now needs to come in and fix the problems rather than allow markets to function so independently. What I show in the book is that how much of a myth there is. What the neoliberal agenda really did was that, yes, it did promote globalization, and also the fact that it promoted financialization, which is that the markets became much bigger than the size of the underlying economy. So globalization and financialization were very much two tenets of the neoliberal era. But one of the biggest myths is the fact that the government has been in retreat. As I show conclusively in the book, I think, which is that if you look at the last few decades, the role of government in every sphere of economic activity has expanded. The basic data is government spending as a share of GDP. If you look at US, you look at Europe, you look at UK, in all these places, government spending as a share of GDP has increased. In fact, in Europe and UK, it's increased much more than it has in the US.
Because of crises.
Right.
This is partly because of COVID. So it's not only interventionism for the sake of it. This is to counter a problem.
Right. No, it's a 100-year line. So it's not a line which is sort of, goes up in just the pandemic and stuff. They take the US, that government spending as a share of GDP used to be 3% back in the 1920s. Now it is close to 40%. Similar trajectory in Europe and UK. In fact, government spending as a share of GDP used to be lower than America right up until the 1980s. And from the 1980s, it's gone up a lot. So, this whole talk, this Reagan-Thatcher revolution of the retreat in government, that they changed the way in which the deficits were financed, but not in sort of paring back on spending. They sort of then cut taxes without sort of matching it with any spending cuts of any consequence. So therefore, we have the situation where most Western governments, including the UK today, are running record budget deficits, and the debt levels are very high. And this is not how it used to be in like America or Britain. In fact, for hundreds of years, they ran budget surpluses consistently. But from 1970s onwards, these countries have rarely run a budget surplus.
What chance of it going down?
Very little. As I argue in the book at the end, that the only way out is through. That the only time
like that Robert Frost quote, yeah.
Exactly, which is that the only time where governments sort of pay back is when they have a crisis. Now, this is what happened in some of the Nordic countries, which is that those countries are often held as these models of democratic socialism and how the government plays a enabling role. But even in those countries, when government spending the share of GDP got too high, the budget deficits got too high in the early 1990s, they had a crisis. And only when you had a crisis, they began to pare back. So in fact, those countries have done better in terms of productivity and economic growth than a lot of Europe has done, because they have been sort of course, from a very high base, they've been downsizing the government. And most of those countries have been running budget surpluses or at least budget balances, unlike core Europe or UK, which are running these big budget deficits.
Can we just talk about the role of the electorate in all of this? Because we're sitting here in the UK on a polling day with a big election. Part of the narrative has been that neither party is really setting out huge reductions in the numbers you're talking about in terms of state intervention. And you can see it in France, you can see it in Italy, you can see it in America, that more and more electorates want more from their governments. So how do you talked about the Nordic countries, how did they do it? How did they kind of pare back while also giving the electorate what they wanted?
Well, they pared back because they had no choice. I think that this is one of those things which exist. That a lot of people, including here, some of the elite economists sort of say we unnecessarily did austerity and in places like Greece and other places. But these countries did it because they had no choice. When you run out of other people's money, you have no choice but then to pare back in terms of what you do. So that's what I say, that unless you pare back, that you have a crisis, it's very hard to pare back. Now, the issue is that governments are doing this to keep the citizens happy. Well, if it was working, then they'd be getting re-elected. Instead, trust in governments across Western societies is at record lows. And also the fact that you have such poor economic growth as a result of all this. At the end of the day, people want the pie to grow bigger, so there's more for them to share of. If you have stagnant per capita incomes, then you're obviously going to get a lot of anti-establishment feeling, regardless of what your political leanings are.
Ruchir, what's the problem with the government actually being a bigger regulator about spending more and borrowing more? Fundamentally, what does that do?
I think that's a great question, because that's the productivity paradox, which is that you are damaging the creative, destructive fiber of an economy with such intervention. That is not what capitalism is supposed to be. Capitalism is supposed to be pro-competition, pro-churn. Instead, with all these interventions, make capitalism feel like it's pro-big business and pro the entrenched.
But it's saving jobs. It's saving business, isn't it?
If it's doing that, it's also undermining the dynamism of the economy. So yes, you're keeping alive a lot of deadwood companies. Remember, this term zombie companies was popularized in Japan in the 1990s, when a lot of companies which couldn't earn enough to even cover their interest payments kept going, right? So that's how zombie companies were there. These companies are not supposed to exist in a capitalist society. Back in the US or UK, the number of zombie companies as a share of the total listed companies was as low as 2 or 3% back in the 1980s, when the UK, US press would mock Japan for running these zombie companies. Today, guess what? UK has about the highest number of zombie companies in the world. 22% of the total number of listed companies in UK can be classified as zombie companies.
If the government hadn't stepped in, would we now be in a recession? And would you argue that that's a good thing because actually it gets rid of, zombie companies?
Nobody wants a recession. Nobody wills a recession. But if you end up at times having a recession, there is a cleansing effect to it. So I think we have to make this trade-off. Do we want higher long-term growth and higher productivity? Or, as I argue in the book, that this culture of pain management that has become so sort of popular, which is like in the US as well, which is that the slightest hint of any trouble, we administer drugs to the patient. And that's how the US has sort of become hooked to this opiate crisis. The same sort of approach now has come to economic management. Slightest hint of trouble, we're going to administer stimulus in the name that we are doing this to smoothen out the cycles and to alleviate any pain. But in doing so, we are completely destroying the creative, destructive fiber of the economies.
I mean, let's just take COVID and the pandemic. Do you think they had an option not to spend the many, many hundreds of billions that they spent?
Yeah, so I'll make 2 points here. One, the fact is that the governments felt emboldened to spend so much and do the lockdowns, to start with, because they thought they could just paper it over by spending. So maybe the approach to lockdowns should have been smarter in terms of, rather than just saying, okay, everybody just, we have to stay in and we're going to just paper this over by giving you massive amounts of stimulus. There was something wrong with that. Two, that yes, if you're going to tell businesses to shut down, then you have to give them relief. The issue is that the indiscriminate kind of relief that was given, it was unprecedented, where a lot of very well-off rich businesses got enormous amounts of relief because of this. And then to expect no consequences from that is foolhardy. So we had a burst in inflation. And more than inflation, I think what also irritates many people, and especially the average person, is the burst you had in asset price inflation, when prices of properties jump up so much due to so much easy money. Remember, a lot of people in places like UK are feeling that it is so difficult to buy a new home now because these home prices have surged so much, and it's happened like in the US even more. So that creates a lot of disenchantment. So I think we have to think through what the consequences of these actions are.
Is it really a fair comparison to see what's happening now with, for example, some of the banks that the US bailed out or some of the things that happened in the UK compared to 100 years ago?
So where are we going to draw a line on this? Which is that every time there is a small crisis, because we're going to feel that small business or medium-sized bank is going to go out of business, that we have to bail it out? Is that the culture that we have come to? And in terms of how long are we going to afford to be able to do this, which is that how long are we going to keep running these deficits that we have and keep piling on debt? So where do we draw the line? Even when it came to in the US, a mid-sized bank of rich depositors, goes belly up, which is Silicon Valley Bank. And the impulse is to go out and intervene and to save it from happening with the same question. If we don't do that, we'll have an entire system collapsing.
I can see the headlines here in the UK press. I mean, if some of the previous governments did not intervene or put money out,
it would have been electoral death, or they would have worried it would have been electoral death.
They've still had electoral death. So in terms of that, what have they gained by doing it? We have still had multiple governments. We have still had electoral death. So if these policies were succeeding, then these governments should be getting re-elected, not getting thrown out of office. So if these policies of saving jobs ostensibly or of doing these bailouts, if all of this was working, then surely the government should be getting re-elected. But as I argue in the book, that the number of governments getting re-elected in the Western world has declined in an appreciable way over the last 10 or 20 years. Even the US, as you know, the approval ratings of leaders across the Western world is at a record low. So if these policies were working and they say they're justified, then surely these governments should get re-elected instead of this huge amount of anti-establishment feeling. The fact that in most countries now, including here, the average voter feels that they will not be better off than their parents. That's a huge sort of decline in confidence that's taking place.
Just to test the point one more time. If you look at the polling, people want more spending on their public services and elsewhere. So you are right that something is not working. I think we all agree. But equally, the stimulus that an elected politician is getting is how do you have that conversation with the voters where you say you may want more spending and you may want your public services to be better, but actually economically, for the reasons you've set out, Ruchir, it's not worked.
as I say in the book, the first step to a cure is to diagnose what the problem is. If you're going to say that the problem is small government, then that's the wrong sort of thing to say. Secondly, I think that you're right that every voter feels that they're entitled to more in terms of from the government. That's a fair thing. When the voter also sees that who is the government bailing out, right? That the governments are bailing out these big banks ostensibly to save jobs. That, as I argue, is a modern form of trickle-down economics, which is this argument that you got to save these big businesses because if you don't do it, there'll be job losses down the line. When the voter sees that, they are even more livid. That if the government's doing that for big businesses and the government's doing that for big banks, then I deserve even more. So I think that sort of is what corrodes capitalism, and that is what makes people lose faith in capitalism. The average person's thinking, if those guys are getting bailed out, why am I not getting much more out of this?
Lots of voters did. I mean, they had, with furlough, they had their salaries or wages paid for quite a long time, nearly a year. And then with, in the UK, we've had energy bills paid for a considerable period as well.
Yeah.
Parts of them paid.
Yeah.
The kind of equality of help was a bit more there. But in the book, you do have best practice, don't you? Because you talk positively about East Asian economies and that they're allowing capitalism to be more unfettered.
I mean, I quote 3 examples. There's a whole chapter in the book, which says where capitalism still works. Now, this is to show examples of countries that have given their people more economic freedom over time. So for me, capitalism, it's back to basics. What is capitalism for me? Capitalism is about giving people as much economic freedom as possible, for the government to have a role as a facilitator, but not for the government to micromanage affairs of people and to be overly involved. So in the book, as I show, there are 3 different countries I show there in terms of Switzerland, Taiwan and Vietnam. I picked these 3 countries. It seems like an odd lot, but 3 countries which are across the income curve. One's the richest country in the world, Switzerland, how it has the maximum amount of economic freedom of any country in the world. Its people are amongst the happiest if you look at the happiness indices, and yet it is the richest. And it has been able to do so with much lower government spending as a share of the GDP than any other country in Europe. Light touch regulation, right? So that's how it does it. I quote Taiwan as an East Asian example, that people talk about East Asia, in terms of as this sort of countries with very good governments and how they facilitated growth. But in places like Taiwan, as I show, Taiwan, even Korea, that government spending as a share of the economy is half that of countries here in the West. And yet they were praised a lot in the pandemic of being able to manage that pandemic very well. Shows you that when you have a very tech-savvy state, you can get a lot out of the state without having to throw so much money at it. And then I show Vietnam, which is still a relatively poor country, that how it's been giving its people more economic freedom. The state has been withdrawing, and how Vietnam is emerging now as such a big manufacturing powerhouse in the region. So these are 3 examples where the common thread is you give people more economic freedom and you end up getting much better economic results. The Western countries are moving in the opposite direction after being these beacons of economic freedom for decades, if not centuries.
But Ruchir, Switzerland, wealth per capita is one of the largest in the world, and they also government engineered the big takeover of Credit Suisse. So I don't know how laissez-faire they are.
No, in terms of there's no country today which is a perfect nation. So there's no country which is laissez-faire, right? And as I say in the book, there's no going back to 19th century laissez-faire capitalism. That model is dated. What you need now is the balance to be correct, which is the fact that you have countries where the government's going to play a role. The days of the 1920s where the government spending the share of GDP was 3% and the government just spent all its time delivering mail or doing some defense, those days are gone. You need a welfare state now. But I think that you need to get the balance correct. So all I'm saying in the book is that let's at least recognize that we are so out of balance just now. And how do we get the balance correct so that we get back to capitalism, or at least let's stop calling this capitalism. Most young people in these countries today say they would prefer socialism over capitalism. But this is not capitalism what we have today. We have socialism for the rich. In a way, we have socialized risk along the curve. So let's not call this capitalism anymore. And let's say that, okay, if this is the system we want, this is a form of democratic socialism, and this is what we're going to get. But the result also we have to live with, which is lower productivity growth, lower economic growth, and possibly higher inequality, and a feeling of the average person that there is not an equality of opportunity for them.
Do you think if that balance is redressed, that the outcomes of elections would differ, including here in the UK?
It's possible. I'm saying that there couldn't be anything worse, right? Which is the fact that this idea that you keep, and even the UK government coming in, if you look at it, it seems to be a lot more pragmatic, right? I mean, it's supposed to be Labour, but I think even they have sort of recalibrated in terms of what they are. They're not talking about, they're also talking that we want to be both pro-Labour and pro-wealth creation. It's not a sort of, thing like France or other places where it's like, very antithetical to the concept of wealth creation. And yet look at the example of France, that the number of billionaires in France today as a share of the economy is among the largest in the world, higher than US or UK. And you have government spending there as a share of GDP at 58%. Can you imagine the irony of that? Such an active state where government spending as a share of GDP is second to possibly only North Korea. And yet you have a culture there where the number of billionaires you have in France today is among the largest in the world. So, how is that achieving any better result?
Ruchir, thank you.
Enjoyed that. Thank you.
Great. Perfect. Amazing. Thanks for listening to this week's In the City from Bloomberg. This episode was hosted by me, Francine Lacqua, David Merritt, and Allegra Stratton. It was produced by Summer Sadi. Production support and sound design by Moses Andem. Brendan Francis Newman is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is head of podcasts. Special thanks to Ruchir Sharma. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts.